Good afternoon, and thank you very much for waiting. We would now like to begin the online press briefing by Foreign Press Center. I'll be serving as a moderator today. My name is Kodama, the president of FPCJ. One of the megatrends in the world is such that the center of the world's economy has shifted from the west to the east and from the north to the south. In other words, it's Asia who has been driving the world's economic growth as a global growth center. However, the COVID-19 pandemic has directly hit even the Asian economy, which was the center for the growth, and the recovery path for the Asian economy remains unclear. How will the Asian economy play out in the post-COVID-19 era? What are the expected roles for China and Japan as the second and the third largest economic powers in the world? Today, we have an honor to have with us Mr. Masatsugu Asakawa, president of the Asian Development Bank, who is one of the most well-versed in this theme, to give us a talk. For your reference, President Asakawa, back in May 2016, the G20 Financial Ministers Summit was held in Sendai, and back then he was serving as the Vice Minister of Finance for International Affairs. And before that summit, he gave us a briefing at FPCJ right before the summit. Ever since then, this is his second time talking to us. So we'll be hearing from him first for about half an hour in the beginning with the English simultaneous interpretation, and we'd like to spend the remaining time for Q&A. Please do not hesitate to ask any questions, as this is a rare opportunity. If you do have a question, if you'd like to ask questions in Japanese, you can write in the question using a Q&A icon, or let us know using a raise hand button. If you'd like to ask questions in English, please write your questions in Q&A icon. Sorry for the technical issue, and sorry for causing trouble to you. If you wish to ask questions in English, please write your questions using a Q&A icon even during the presentation. As for the presentation document for today's briefing, we have sent out the information to your mail addresses one prior to this briefing, both in Japanese and English. If you don't have a document, please let us know through the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen. So, Mr. Asakawa, over to you.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I am Asakawa of ADB. It is a great pleasure to join in this program at Foreign Press Center of Japan. I appreciate for the invitation. The entire time is only 1 hour. I can't talk much, but 4 points. First is the outline of ADB. And then the second point, the impact of pandemic to Asian economy as well as its outlook. The third point, now then, how ADB has involved with the pandemic. And the fourth point, post-pandemic world. Considering the post-pandemic world, what kind of policy package would be necessary for Asia? So my main presentation points would be 4, as I described to you. At your hand, I think the PowerPoint slides have been distributed. So please listen to my presentation as you watch PowerPoint pages. First is page 2. It's the second page. This talks about the outline overview of ADB. It was founded in 1966. In the beginning, it started with 31 members, but now we have 68 members. There is a breakdown of the members, 49 regional members, 19 non-regional members. So, of course, for non-regional members do not borrow, so they are expected to play a role as a donor. Now, the 8 economies are graduated. So out of 68, only out of 49, 41 countries are the members who are borrowing from ADB. The 3,658 staffs, they are not located only in Manila, but they are dispersed across the region. Next slide, please. So this slide talks about the ADB regional members, a map of the members. Black dot, there are black country numbers and orange colored country names. The orange colored country names, economy names, are the developing countries or countries graduating from the developing nations status. So you see Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, China. Of course, Japan, Hong Kong, Korea, Taiwan, Singapore, Hong Kong, they have graduated. Actually, they received the loans from ADB, and in the course, there are countries who have graduated. I think this is one of the great features of ADB. There are economies who can graduate from the receiving end. Another point is a little political in nature. If you read the member countries, you will realize China, PRC, is included. At the same time, Taipei, China, as we call it at ADB, these economies are simultaneously joining in the organization of ADB. Taipei, China was the original member, but later on, PRC joined. And then in the case of UN organizations, in the case of Taiwan, they have moved out. But in the case of ADB, they did not move out or they stayed. So this is one of the unique features of ADB. Next page. This is the economic outlook for developing Asia under pandemic, the impact on the economic growth of Asia. In 2020, it was a negative growth, minus 0.1%. This is the first contraction in 6 decades. But this year, 2021, 7.1% and 22, 5.4% is the growth outlook. So from minus 0.1 to 7.1, it's an enormous growth. But there is a little trick to this. Statistically, the preceding year's growth rate is very low. And of course, the next year's growth rate becomes bigger. It is base effect. Because of this base effect, it is very great. So it looks like a V-shaped recovery, but it's not V-shaped. If you look into the right-hand side graph, this talks about the real GDP level in developing Asia. It is not the growth rate, it is GDP level. In some years, it does not go back to the pre-COVID trend. There is a gap from the pre-pandemic trend. So there is a moderate U-shaped recovery. I think that more characteristically and accurately describes the growth. Now, country-specific, economy-specific breakdown, page 5. So I said 7.1% growth, but breakdown would show different situations. East Asia, 7.6%. They're doing very well. Basically, PRC has a very robust growth, 8.1% for this year. That is the outlook. So PRC is leading so that the East Asian area as a whole is registering good growth. The export and trade is very good for PRC. Next comes South Asia. South Asia. Last year, it was minus 5.5%. So because of the base effect, this year's growth is expected to be 8.8. But if you look into India, this year's growth rate is expected to be 10%. Around May, there were so many cases. They had a very hard time, but because of the vaccine rollout and lockdown, in the past, it was a nationwide lockdown, but now they are changed to the region-specific, district-specific lockdowns. So if things go as they are now, they can be expected to register 10%. So this will be the prime mover for South Asian growth. Next one is Kazakhstan, many Central Asian countries, primary commodities economies, they were hit very seriously, but they recovered rather substantially. So it's not high growth, but to a certain extent, we can expect growth. That is the number. And then the tourism nations like Fiji and Thailand is also included. The countries who depend upon tourism, the travelers are not coming back. Vaccine is vaccinated, but they are not coming back. So toward 2021, the negative impact will continue for the tourism nations. And what is not mentioned here, Southeast Asian countries, minus 4%. This year, there is a slight recovery at the 3.1, but there is a variant pandemic and vaccination is slowing down. So compared with other countries, the outlook for the growth for Southeast Asia in 2021 is a little lower. In this context, the next page talks about China. So, as I said, this year, 8.1%, very high growth rate expected for PRC. But actually, before COVID-19, as you can see in the graph, from 2014 until 2019, there was slightly a deceleration of their economy. It started with the 7.5, 6.8, 6.9, and 6.0 was for 2019. So everybody was wondering when they are going to go down 6% range. But now, because of the COVID-19, it's 2.3. So this year, they will go back to 8.1. But after the COVID-19, I think it is very likely that they will go to the moderate growth. It is not 7%, 8% growth. It will go back to the original trend. So the ADB in 2022 economic outlook regarding China is 5.5%. Less than 6%. That's the outlook. On the right-hand side, there are points mentioned. In the medium term, structural factors are also contributing to long-run trend growth moderation. So rebalancing from investment to consumption-driven growth in the immediate so because of the excessive production facilities, they are moving from investment to consumption-driven growth. In that process, excessive production facilities will have to be streamlined. That is the challenge. Coal and steel making would be affected at the same time, demographic reasons. So one-child policy was the policy, and therefore aging was very fast in China. So then the potential growth rate would come down because of that, because of the aging. At the same time, social security will have to be introduced. So it will have a heavy burden on the fiscal situation in PRC. The third bullet point talks about the shifting to a more advanced development phase, driven less by low-cost labor and more by innovation. They will go from a medium income level to a high income level countries. And then they cannot depend upon the low-cost labor. They will have to improve productivity. It's not written here, but the IP, intellectual property, will have to be protected. So innovation will have to be regarded very important. So they will have to introduce a lot of policy options and initiatives. Otherwise, sustainable growth would be very difficult for PRC. So these are the structural reasons. So it will be moderate growth. And in the short term, policy priorities like heading of financial risks, controlling the real estate industry, it would be very so. Last week, the Evergrande Corporation was the focus of the big commotion. Another point is controlling environmental pollution from in 2060, they will become carbon neutral, they declared. Also, they will have to reduce rural urban inequalities. It doesn't mention here, but to a certain extent, the public funds will have to go to private sector. There is a huge debt because of the pandemic. The debt will become very insoluble. So the public money, to a certain extent, will have to flow into the private sector. Bearing those points in mind, beyond the 2021, I think their growth recovery will be rather moderate rather than rapid. Next several pages, talking about the Asian countries as a whole. Page 7 on the left-hand side talks about the daily new COVID-19 cases. 7-day moving average is the number. Around May, there is a high spike there, and then it subsided. And then after August, it spiked again. It is shown, it is because of the South Asia. And then the orange is Southeast Asia. So in these countries, the variant species, variant strains are being the problem. On the left-hand side, the persons vaccinated against blue denotes fully vaccinated, and orange is partially vaccinated. So these are the proportions of the vaccination. Excluding PRCs, only small countries, Palau, Singapore, Bhutan, Maldives. And most of the countries, actually, 2/3 of the Asia-Pacific countries, the fully vaccinated people's percentage is less than 30%, 29% actually. So compared with other regions, US, full vaccination 52%, mid-August number. EU, 58%. Japan's number is 46%. So compared with those numbers, the vaccination rollout is very slow in Asian regions, and that is impacting the economic activities. That is one point. The second point, next page. Regarding external sectors, one is the export, and another point is the tourist arrivals. On the side of the export within the region, there is a steady growth. Sector-specific numbers are shown, and it's very interesting. In the beginning, pandemic-related products or electronic devices, these products were demanded because of the stay-home situation. But in the recent past, especially from this year, other exported items are growing very good. So I think that this area has expanded. So there are country differentials, but I think it is contributing, export is contributing to the growth of Asia as a whole. Right-hand side, on the other hand, tourist arrivals have not returned. There are many graphs joined here. One exception is Maldives. From earlier on, they were very positive in inviting tourists, and the policy became very effective.
So they're seeing the recovery, and Georgia is catching up recently. Other countries, however, there's a slow recovery of tourists coming back, so which is becoming a hindrance for the economic recovery. So the vaccination rollout and the export trend and the recovery of the tourists, with those, that we can explain the growth situation of the Asian countries. But what you see on page 9, just one point, you see the data by country. The higher the vaccination rollout is, the higher the growth rate is, which is quite prevalent. Page 10, rather than the growth rate, looking at the gaps, I mentioned that it's not V-shaped, but rather U-shaped moderate. But looking at this gap, the pre-COVID forecast compared to that, and 2020, when the COVID-19 hit, the gap between what was hit and pre-COVID for the entire Asia, 2.5% below, but East Asia is actually doing the best driven by China. So the gap will be closed in 2022, 0.7% only. And the biggest gap is observed in Southeast Asia, actually, as I mentioned earlier, 8.6% gap. And as was mentioned earlier, because of the stronger momentum of the variant strain and because of the slow vaccination rollout, the biggest gap is seen in Southeast Asia, followed by the Pacific. Because of the slow recovery of the tourism in South Asia, especially back in May and June with the variant, there was a significant increase of the new infections in India. That's why 5.3%. And Central Asia is a bit better with the recovery of the prices for the export products. So much for the impact on Asian economy. Now, moving on to my third point, how ADB has been responding to the COVID-19. There are two major milestones. So one is back in April last year, as you can see at the very top, ADB announced a $20 billion or 2 trillion yen comprehensive package. You see 4 elements below. If I'm explaining, not in the order, but what we did first was at the bottom left, technical assistance and grants. What we did here was that shortage of masks, February, March, no ventilators, no PPE, no best fit. So countries made a request for the emergency request. So with TR for grants, we provided some healthcare medical related supplies totaling $240 million. That was back in February, March last year. And in April, May, and June, we moved to the quick dispersing budget support. So what happened here was that this applied to advanced countries as well, but there was a fiscal stimulus to support the social security and the vulnerable sector were to be strengthened. For instance, specifically tourism or the retail, which were biggestly hit. There was a support given to those. But their tax revenue was going down, but there is a bigger loss, of course. And in advanced countries, they issued the bond domestically to procure, but in the case of the developing countries, that cannot be done. So ourselves, the World Bank or IMF, in some cases, provided the loans to finance the fiscal packages. And there was a heightened need for such a request in April and May. And COVID-19 pandemic response option, or CPRO in short, that's the new framework that we built. Before that, we actually worked with the projects for the solar power projects or digging tunnels or building dams, so we provided some support for that. But now, for the government fiscal, ADB is to provide the direct support, not to the projects, but to the programs. So that's the image. So that's what we started. And as you can see here, as of today, $10.2 billion of CPRO has been committed to provide fiscal packages of different countries. That's the second point. And the third point is, as you can see in other COVID-19 response projects, other than those fiscal support through the ordinary project for the health and social protection, insurance related, we provide support amounting to $3.25 billion. Last but not least, the support for the private sector was provided. It's mainly for the sovereign. But we have been doing that from before, and in the COVID-19 framework, as you can see here, $527 million of direct private sector, especially to support the working capital, especially in China, Wuhan. There's a company called Jointown, a medical equipment logistics firm, that we provided support for the working capital, or $4.34 billion through a short-term financing program for trade finance. The trade can be disrupted with the shortage of finance. The export gets suspended for the necessary medical supplies. So to avoid that, through the financial institutions, short-term trade finance program to be supported, a total of 20 billion as of September today. About 18.5 billion has been committed already, as you can see at the top. Now, for us doing that, other development partners or commercial institutions did the co-finances. On top of this 18.5 billion, there was another 15 billion. So out of this 15, 4 billion was AIB. AIB, especially for ADB's CPRO, provided the support. In JICA, 2 billion. So the co-financing to the partners that were mobilized. And the second support is vaccine support. In December last year, now that the vaccines were available in the market, so the countries requested the support to procure those vaccines. So in December last year, we announced a separate $9 billion, separate from those 20 billion, Asia Pacific Vaccine Access Facility or APVAX, mainly for a safe, high-quality vaccination purchase to be supported. That kind of financing mechanism was built. And that was initiated from January, and as of September this year, 2.3 out of 9 was already committed. And as you can see, this much amount has been approved. So $321 of the co-financing, the full amount is supported by AIIB for this AVAX, Philippines and to Philippines and the Mongol. There was a co-financing to AIB. What is important here is that, as you can see, below the vaccine eligibility criteria, it has to be a safe and effective vaccinations. So there is eligibility criteria in an objective way. So 3 billion, whether the COVAX has selected or what was approved by HW or a stringent regulatory authority license. There are several authorities around the world. So whether the vaccine has been licensed. So only for those who pass the criteria, we have to provide the financing. And the one thing that we noticed after we started to implement this, to support the financing purchase, we can do it through ABIVAX. But even with the support, realistically, those developing countries, for them, whether they can get an access to the vaccine in the market immediately, sometimes it was difficult for them to be able to buy, but because of the humongous demand, but the supply capacity was not catching up. And furthermore, the advanced countries, there is more of an inclination skewed toward the advanced countries. So the developing countries are sort of left behind. So just providing IPVAX, whether the developing countries can quickly purchase the vaccines, that was not necessarily the case. So what we're thinking right now is that, of course, we will continue to provide the support to purchase, but because of the lack of supply within the region, the capacity for supply needs to be strengthened. And for that purpose, we would like to provide a separate support for that. And we are looking for some candidates to be able to realize that scheme. Let me skip the next page. And page 14. So this is ADB's overall commitment, annual projected commitment. In 2020, 31.6 billion was the amount. Compared to the years before that, well, the commitment amount has gone up by about 30% or so, of course, because of the COVID-19, like 10 billion of the private investment. In 2021, now some special factor has gone a little bit, so 25.6, still a bit higher than the regular average years, but it has coming back to the normal level. Now, 31.1 out of that in 2020, about half of that was to respond to the COVID-19. About half of 31.6. Remaining half is a non-COVID related, mid to long-term development agenda, reducing poverty, climate change agenda, or infrastructure accounted for half of this commitment. Last but not least, page 15. This is going to be my fourth point. Going forward, post-COVID-19, in the post-COVID-19 era, for the economy in the Asia Pacific, what kind of policies will be required? And there are 5 points here. The first one is a further deepening of the regional cooperation integration. What I mean by here is that, of course, there could be various discussions, but I think that once we settle down with the COVID-19, I think the globalization will come back. Some experts may say that with the COVID-19, there's going to be a further promote the divide of the economy in the value chain will remain cut and will be segmented, and that will be the end of it. Some people say that, but I don't agree with that. I think to some extent, the momentum of the globalization will come back. Well, to begin with, vis-a-vis the globalization, COVID-19 was really the attack of the sovereignty, but it's not that it's about the epidemic. We were forced to implement the lockdown. It was not necessarily because of any other factor. And then the COVID-19 was a global level crisis, which required global level solutions. So just for a specific region, to survive, leaving other regions behind. So that's why I think that globalization will come back. And if that's the case, there are two important points. One thing is that we have to fight any form of the protectionism. We'll continue to do so. And as you can see here, the global trends, in order to complement that, open regional cooperation will need to be further deepened. Specifically, regional trade and investment need to be further strengthened. And in order to supplement the global value chain, we need to diversify the regional value chain and to enhance the health security that will go beyond the borders. So with that, the covering the globalization can be benefited, and for us to go back to the growth engine. The second point is, well, unfortunately, with this pandemic, what made it clear is the inequality, the widening gap of the income, especially in this region. The absolute poverty, those living under $1.9 a day, there was a 1.2 billion back in 1990. And with the economic development, it has gone down, and in 2017 has come down to 200 million, 1.2 billion to 200 million, which is great. But unfortunately, with this pandemic, about 80 million now joined this, or went back to this absolute poverty group. Then the different markets, in order to survive, save those people, would have to strengthen the social protection programs within the fiscal packages. But over mid to long term, to support the economic recovery and growth, and to promote the development process for them to be engaged, what would be required is not just to provide a subsidy or the grant, but we need to provide high quality jobs, employment, so that they can participate in the production activities. For that purpose, what we need to do is to secure that the insurance sector and the education, the investment into the education sector is what we must work on. And that's what you see on the second point, investment in human capital and the social protection.
The third point, I will come back to it later on. The fourth point is harnessing digitalization. What is digitalization? Because of the COVID-19 pandemic, you will know work from home, e-banking, and remote education in in one short span of time, it developed. So ADB is also trying to sophisticate the operation. But the one thing we have to be careful is a digital divide. The 50% of the population do not have the access to broadband. Even if they had access, it is too expensive. The poor people cannot cannot use it. So we will have to work for the closing of the digital divide and ensuring, and at the same time, we will have to ensure cybersecurity. So this is the fourth important point. The last point is strengthening domestic resource mobilization. We call it DRM. This time around, because of the COVID countermeasures, tax revenue is declining and fiscal expenses expanding. Naturally, it means that the fiscal structure has become very vulnerable and public debt increased, especially denominated in dollar terms. What is worrying is that key currency country, US, will normalize its financial policy, monetary policy sooner or later, and then interest rate will come up. In the past, when US raised interest rate in capital markets or to the capital markets and the emerging markets, larger or small, something changed very radically. There was a huge pressure on depreciating the currency in question. I'm not saying that it'll happen immediately, but in the medium term, we have to be prepared for that. Another point is SDG accomplishment. There are many agenda items to that end, SDGs. In order to accomplish, you cannot depend upon the outside borrowing. I think you have to have a domestic resource mobilization. You have to have a solid tax increase so that you can have the funds available for the policies for SDG. I think that is more sustainable. Asia Pacific region is tax revenue ratio against the DGP is low to begin with. In other words, the tax system has to be brushed up and tax administration will have to be improved. So implementation, execution of tax policies will have to be sophisticated, and BEPS, discussion on BEPS must go improved. In the Asia Pacific region, BEPS is very relevant. So once pandemic is controlled in this region from various countries, investments will come. The multilateral companies will come to this region and they will do a lot of investment activities. But in order to make their profit, if they are making a profit, appropriate amount of tax will have to be paid. That is the basic tenet of BEPS. So currently, BEPS have 15 action plans, 14 have completed, and Pillar 1, Pillar 2 is the final point. So BEPS discussion has to be conducted very positively. So through G20, by bringing in healthy tax situation of this region, Asia Pacific, DRM and international tax cooperation will have to be activated very much. That is what I'm thinking. Well, I have completed my time, but there is just one point. 16 and 17 pages, climate change. There is going to be COP16, so I will like to talk about it. I think that there are several points that we are working very hard on as ADB. The first point is the second bullet point on this page, climate finance commitments. By 2030, at least 75% of the number of committed operations will be supporting climate change mitigation and adaptation. This is a second bullet point. So this is the target. Another thing is from 19 to 30 for 12 years, altogether $80 billion 2019 to 2030, climate finance from ADB's own resources will reach 80 billion. So 80 divided by 12 per year, it will be $680 or so million. So because of the the number declined because of the COVID pandemic. So it didn't reach the yearly average. This year we are doing very hard, but we still suffer from the pandemic impact. So we can't clear $6 billion target. So as soon as possible, we would like to regain to this original target, so that by 2030, we want to reach 80 billion. That is what we are targeting. Next page, please. This is the last page. The first point, international community, it's not about ADB, but all MDBs would be the same. So the point is that we have to align operations with the Paris Agreement, but by what time do we have to align? So deadline has to be clarified. It's been demanded. So regarding the sovereign, we will do it by July 2023, and regarding non-sovereign operations by July the 85% and 25 by 2025, we will have the complete aligning. The next one is energy policy. It's outdated, so we are in the process of revising it. We will need the approval by the board, but precisely, of course, we need the approval of the board, so I can't say anything definitive, but for me, especially we will completely remove distance from the coal burning power generation. So the third point is then what about the existing coal power generations? So we will have to move coal to clean. ETM, Energy Transmission Mechanism Partnership. This is an idea. What do we mean by that? Donors and various charitable organizations are talking about financing, and then the concessional resources would be another idea, and set up a pilot ETM funds with the commercial sponsors in 1 to select countries. So this is not the normal funds, it's a concessional funds. For example, the fund may be in Korea, in the Philippines, or Indonesia. There are existing power plants, and with using this fund, we will purchase such facilities. But this cost is concessional. Therefore, originally planned 30-40-year loans would be the original program, and depreciation period could be shortened and depreciate sooner. For example, in 10 years or 15 years, the entire loan package could be retired. So we won't work on anything about the new coal power generations, but for the existing coal plants, we would like to have energy transition mechanism. And if possible, we would like to have the launch of pilot funds in 1 or 2 select countries. The last point, I said that I talked about the certain amount. So rather than mitigation, adaptation should receive more financing. So regarding that, a couple of months ago, ADB has come up with additional targets. Sorry. From that, I said $80 billion from 19 to 24. But in this period, we want to focus upon the adaptation. So a couple of months ago, so 19 to 24, in a period of 6 years, we will have the cumulative financing of $9 billion. So that will be the additional introduction. We want to work on this. In any way, looking toward the COP26, I have introduced some of the programs that we carry out at ADB. Time is up, so thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Asakawa. Sorry for the time constraint, but thank you for a very comprehensive yet precise presentation. So for the remaining time, we'd like to have a Q&A session. First of all, we would like to take the questions from the members of the foreign press. Of course, we welcome the Japanese press as well. If you have a question, please use the Q&A icon. If you'd like to ask questions in Japanese, you can also use the raise hand button at the bottom of the screen if I call up on you. Please make sure that you unmute your microphone and state your name and affiliation before raising a question. Now, the first question, Mr. Michael Fern from New York Times. For Cambodia, well, should I answer in English? No, Japanese is fine. Of course, the tourism accounts for a good amount of GDP, so there is a high level of contribution by tourism, but Pacific Islands, as I mentioned earlier, well, countries like Thailand, compared to those countries, the weight dependence on tourism is not that big, and it's just a matter of relative comparison. So I think tourism, I talked about the slow recovery in tourism yet. And of course, I hope that we wish for the quick recovery, but for Cambodia, non-tourism diversified industry sector base is available. So those non-tourism sectors shall be recovered to bottom up the overall economy. And on our part, inclusive and sustainable and also resilient recovery of Cambodian economy would like to provide much support.
Next question is from Japanese journalist from Mr. Yoshida Takashi of Asahi. There is a question. International taxation rule is being discussed at G20 and OECD, trying to have the final conclusion. And you yourself was the top person of the tax committee of OECD. You were instrumental in making rules. President Asakawa, what is your thinking about the movement at such organizations? What are the hopes and what are the worries of the Asian region? Thank you very much for the question. Well, it's called BEPS. It's a project called BEPS. It started in 2012. When I was the chairman of our tax committee of OECD, this project started for the large multilateral companies are not paying their tax in any places. This dual non-payment, transfer pricing and loopholes, they are making use of that. So it's a project to prevent those activities. Once we began, it was an enormous, regarding 15 points, action points were formulated. And unless we complete the 15 action plans, we will not resolve the problem. From 2012 to 2015, for 3 years, we had a very dense discussion. It was carried out at OECD and the G20 in 2015. Final report was made. Out of 15, excluding just one point, 14 points were agreed as action plans. And after that, come 2016, out of 14 action plans, based upon which from G20 to the whole world, the approach was made, and the first inclusive framework was launched. It was held in Kyoto, and I was the chair of that Kyoto meeting. At that time, 82 countries participated in BEPS, and the country, now we have 139 countries participating into BEPS. There is a global reach. Now, remaining action plan is digital taxation. Actually, at G20, autumn G20 and inclusive framework, we'll try to reach a final conclusion. There are Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. Pillar 1 is a PE principle. Personal establishment principle will be revised so that even without PE, taxation could be imposed. It's a very radical change. Pillar 2 is there should be a basic agreement regarding the corporate tax, minimum level of corporate tax. My thought is this: globalization this has developed so much, and there is a clash against sovereign. For example, the taxing sovereignty, sovereign right of taxation is one thing. The corporations have no borders, and the country-specific taxation has borders. Libra is one question. The Facebook is issuing a quasi currency, and this is causing conflict with the existing sovereign authority. So globalization goes so much, and then the countries will have to sacrifice their sovereign rights in trying to seek the coordination and harmonization. If there is no coordination, countries will go on their own ways to start the digital taxation. If this happens, then this will be distorting the economic activities, distorting impact on the economic activities. In order to avoid that, more neutral economic activities will have to be guaranteed. So the clash against the sovereign taxing authority will have to be reconciled going forward. The second point is that this time around, BEPS is discussed not only at OECD, but G20 and the whole world. The multilateral companies, they will go anywhere they like. So if discussion is limited to OECD, the discussion would not be conclusive. That is why the political relevancy of BEPS is augmented now globally. The last point I would like to say that I talked about COVID-19 pandemic, the fiscal mobilization was made. Of course, it was necessary, but as a result, the fiscal structure became so vulnerable. So once economic recovery is introduced, then various countries will have to change gear from fiscal mobilization to fiscal rehabilitation, and then tax increase will have to come in. So it only multilateral countries are utilizing loopholes of the international taxation, and they are enjoying the profit that they make. This is such an equality in the world of taxation. From that context, BEPS will introduce trustworthiness and the sense of equity in the international taxation world. That is my thought. When it comes to Asia Pacific region, the BEPS is something out of 40 DMCs, 14 countries joining into IF. So the discussion is not expansive in Asia Pacific. According to the current discussion, Pillar 1, Pillar 2, so by 2030, implementation and enforcement will have to be on the radar screen. So it will be a hard work for Asia Pacific. So Asia Pacific should not lag behind the movement of BEPS through various organizations and federations, and through the active policy dialogue. Asia Pacific region will have to activate the discussion on this point. Thank you very much.
Next, from Ms. Aleika Kihara of Reuters, there are two questions. Let me read them out. China's Evergrande ooze. How big of a risk could that destroy Asia's financial system? That's the first part of the question. Then the second part of the question is, how quickly could the Southeast Asian factories recover from the shutdowns caused by the pandemic? And how big is the impact or the damage from such supply bottlenecks could be for Asian and global economies? So those two questions. First of all, about the Evergrande, especially last week. High yield, the fixed income market and equity market, the default risk of Evergrande because of the concern. Well, we need to continue to have a close monitoring, but just one company, Evergrande, that this event would lead to something like a Lehman shock on a global scale. That's a question mark, but I don't think that will lead to that for several reasons. First reason is that what was a surprise for the Lehman shock, but this time the real estate market is rather overheated, and the Chinese authorities is trying to keep it under control with the different actions and countermeasures. for the overheating real estate market. So to some extent, I think there is authorities' stance to try to mitigate the risks. So in that sense, it wasn't a surprise out of the blue, but I think this was anticipated. I think it was within our expectations. That's the first point. And the second point is that Evergrande itself, of course, there's concern about the liquidity for a repetitive maturity, but looking at the balance sheet, the land or the buildings, it might be difficult for them to liquidate immediately, but at least they have affluent assets. They do have sufficient assets. So I think that's the second point that we can still feel rather comfortable. And the third point is not just Evergrande, but the Chinese bank system as a whole. What is inherent capital buffer in Chinese bank system is quite rich, thick. Even if there's a crisis for Evergrande, just one company, there is a sufficient buffer to be able to absorb that as a bank system as a whole. So that's the third point. And the fourth point is that the renminbi bank, according to the press, given what was happening in Evergrande ever since last week, is issuing or supplying the short-term liquidity to the market. So even if anything happens to the Evergrande, there is a buffer for the spillover. I think the preparedness is actually taken care of by the bank. Having said that, however, generally speaking, this Evergrande case, the Chinese real estate market, there is dependence on the bubble, just like those old days in Japan. And that's the background, and especially the local governments. The land price increase was an important source of revenue for the local governments. And if that's gone, then that could have an impact on the fiscal situation of the local governments. And the biggest asset of the household is real estate. The properties are depending on the trends going forward. The financing capabilities of the local governments could be impacted or could have an impact on the consumption by the households. So we need to continue to keep a close eye on that. And the second point, the second question is about the divide of the supply chain. Of course, that's one of the potential risks. However, as I mentioned earlier, with the divided supply chain, whether different countries will continue to supply with the world to still remain fragmented, segmented. I don't think so. The regional supply chain will at least recover. In order to avoid the concentration of a certain risk, I think there will be a diversification, but the segmentation would not be likely to happen. With the diversification, that could mitigate the risks and recover the regional supply chain. And furthermore, as I mentioned earlier, the global supply chain will come back eventually. So as a region, the regional supply chain should support the global supply chain. If we can have that scheme, then the global supply chain, the globalization benefits that can be enjoyed in this region to enjoy the high level of growth and to drive the world's economy once again.
Thank you very much. We only have a couple of minutes. May I ask two simple questions, President? This is an invaluable opportunity. One thing is this, Isas Coleman, new Secretary General, has come with the OECD, Australian Finance Minister. When he assumed his post, in his mission statement, he said that he wants to strengthen the relations with the Asian countries. And the Asian OECD members, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, they are the member countries. So it's the middle income countries are continuing development. So the middle income countries are not members of OECD. Korea is a member. So graduating countries, the eligible countries, so now the ASEAN and other middle income countries trap will be overcome and they will become the member of OECD. They could become the members of OECD. Can you talk about the outlook of that as the president of ADB? What is your idea? Lastly, the co-financing with AIIB you talked about in your presentation. So this coordination and cooperation with the AIIB, do you have any particular outlook you can talk about? These are my questions. Thank you. First is regarding OECD. Well, Mr. Glia's days, it was his idea that relevant discussion will not be complete with the discussion limited to OECD, and G20 has now taken up the topic. And now there is a global framework. It's going beyond the framework of OECD, and 139 countries are discussing the BEPS-related problems, tax-related problems. It's an entirely new world. However, when you think of the membership of OECD regarding Asia, from the Glia's days, there were frequent outreach approaches. To Thailand, to China, approaches were made. Specifically, works are done. However, to join OECD, as you know, there is a very high hurdle. The hurdle is very high. So in a stroke, membership could be gained. No, I don't think it will happen. But that's not the way. But on the topic of tax, you will become the member of IF, or you can make the observer status. So there could be various different options depending upon the situations of countries. The most appropriate levels of discussion could be participated. In the final analysis, of course, they can aim for the full membership, but I think by specific appropriate discussion participation, OECD's relevance will be augmented. It could take time, but I think that approach is most realistic. But as you said, there are graduating countries from ADB in Asian regions. I think it's good to make approach to these countries. Now, regarding AIIB, when pandemic began, AIIB is an infrastructure investment bank. So I was wondering what kind of assistance they are going to assist the pandemic rather than infrastructure, the corona assistance. I was wondering what they were going to happen. There was a very good judgment by the governor of this bank, and they decided on the fiscal assistance World Bank is doing, and ADB has a CIPRO. My understanding is that ADB, World Bank do the fiscal assistance. And if the World Bank does that, they will make some additional, I think it was 5 billion. There is a quota of 5 billion or so that AIIB can make contribution by funds. That was APVAX vaccine assistance. When we do the assistance, they will add on. It is something that we are very grateful. In developing countries, the fiscal situation has a lot of demand, and the vaccine requires a lot of funds. This is not something which can be accomplished by ADB alone or World Bank alone. We can't satisfy the needs. So including AIIB, to the extent possible, our friends, including AIIB, could join hands so that they can contribute their fair shares so that we can respond to the demands of the Asian region. I think which is good. That is good. So the cooperation with the AIIB on the pandemic was done very smoothly. That much I can say so.
Thank you very much. Sorry for going over a little bit time. So with this, we'd like to close today's briefing. President Asakawa of ADB, once again, thank you very much for being with us. If you have one last comment or message, is there anything? Well, as I mentioned several times, the Asia Pacific region will be, there is a potential that it will continue to be the growth engine. There was a setback because of COVID-19 pandemic, but there is a capacity and aspiration to overcome that. So as ADB would like to provide support so that as soon as possible, the Asia Pacific will come back to lead the world's economy. So I will ask for your continued support. Thank you very much, Mr. Asakawa. And to the audience, the members of press, and the members of the embassies and the supporting members, thank you for your participation. With this, we'd like to conclude today's press briefing. Thank you very much. Thank you very much.